Hello and welcome to our 30-minute B2B bootcamp on campaign objectives. Thanks very much for joining us. We are expecting quite a few people today, but we're going to kick off on time so we can make sure we can fit everything in that we've got to go through today. So first off, my name's Heather Barnett. I'm Head of Marketing here at the Marketing Practice, and today I'm joined by demand generation expert and our Managing Director UK here at TMP, Brian Caulfield.
Hello, nice to see you.
For anyone who's not familiar with the Marketing Practice, we are a global integrated B2B agency. We have a specific focus around account-based marketing, demand generation, and channel marketing. As we're going through the slides today, if you have any particular questions, you can always drop them in the Q&A box that you should be able to see at the bottom of your screens. And hopefully we'll get some time at the end to run through those. And equally, at the end, we'll let you know if you're interested in getting a copy of the slides or a recording of the webinar that we'll have available. We'll let you know how you can get hold of that at the end of the session. So what are we hoping that you will be able to take away at the end of the next 30 minutes? First of all, you should have a clear idea on what you need to think about before you're planning any demand generation campaign and what those considerations are going to have in terms of impact on your objectives that you're setting. We hope you'll also take away an understanding about the kind of complexities that are involved in setting objectives and running demand generation campaigns. And also that you'll have some useful tools to take away at the end of this that will help you when you're trying to set realistic objectives for your next campaign. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Brian.
Brilliant, thank you, Heather. So with my expert hat on, I will start. So I think, to set the context, I always, start with, if generating demand was easy, there'd be no need to run demand generation campaigns. And that's kind of the start point for where I really think about, demand and the kinds of things that we need to think about when we're thinking about setting objectives. And for me, it's all about understanding the context of why we're needing to run the demand generation campaign in the first place. And on the screen, we've got four kind of starter questions, if you like. There's more. This isn't an exhaustive list, but this is a good place to start. So what's driving the ask in the first place? Why are we being asked to run a demand generation campaign? Is it that we've, come to the conclusion that we haven't got enough pipeline? Is sales coming to us and saying that we're missing the targets? Because if that's the case, that we need to probably dive a little bit deeper into the reasons why that is the case. Then we think about why now. Is it because we're coming towards the end of a quarter and we're desperate to kind of close the numbers so that we end the quarter on a high? Or is it that potentially we're launching a new product and it could be potentially unproven in the marketplace? And therefore we need to have that lens around the campaign so that when we're thinking about running, creating the objectives. The third thing I like to think about is, what type of opportunity are sales looking for? Typically what we hear from sales is that we want to land big projects, multi-year transformational type projects. Or are they looking for something that's just a foot in the door? Because, those two things are very, very different. And then finally, how many of these leads are we looking to generate from a demand generation campaign? If sales are looking to close one really big deal and they say we need 10 opportunities in order to close that one big deal, let's dive a little bit deeper into why the conversion rates are so low. Alternatively, if we're saying we need to generate 50 leads through this demand generation program, but we've only got one sales guy that's going to be doing the follow-up, how realistic is that the sales guy is actually going to be able to give the time to follow up on that volume of opportunities? And that's a key consideration, that we set objectives for demand generation programs that align to the amount of capacity we've got in the business, so that we're not generating demand that isn't then followed up, because ultimately that's wasted effort. And there's some hygiene factors that we need to consider as well. It strikes me every time that I hear it, a common misconception that I hear, which is, people typically oversimplify how willing people are to talk when it comes to being approached by a cold call or an email or through LinkedIn. You know, if prospects were waiting there with open arms, you know, then there would be no reason to potentially do the campaign in the first place. And just think about it from your own context, where you are getting outreached by salespeople, you know, with a cold call. How do you react to that? You know, whether it's a poorly worded email or a connection request on LinkedIn out of the blue with no context. You know, what are the kind of the gut feels that you have, because they're the same kinds of gut feels that you need to put into the consideration mix when you're thinking about your audience. So I've listed on, you know, using the kind of the analogy of kind of walking up to a door doesn't mean someone's going to be welcoming you with open arms. So in the context of, you know, can't you read the sign? We often come across the idea that, you know, organizations don't take calls, or certain individuals are email only, or, you know, Switchboard are pushing you towards a generic inbox. You know, those kinds of things basically are assigned to kind of say, we don't really appreciate, you know, sales calls, you know, the no hawkers type mentality. But assuming you can get through, you know, somebody who then says, you know, I don't know who you are, that means that you've got to work twice as hard right in the up front to kind of build that credibility and convince them that this is a conversation that you want to take into, you know, for them to take into consideration. So again, really important when thinking about setting your objectives, understanding these kinds of contexts. If they don't understand what you're saying to them right from the outset, because your messaging is too complex, or potentially you're pitching it to the wrong people, you haven't done the targeting in the right way, again, that's going to impact on the outcomes. And, you know, if you're the 10th person that said the same thing to them today, and I get it a lot from kind of data vendors, for example, you know, trying to sell data lists, you know, if it's generic and there isn't any kind of differentiation, then that's going to be, again, a hampering factor overall. And finally, you know, the quality of the data, you know, if you're asking for people, or you're sending communications into an organization and the data's incorrect, then that just shows a lack of credibility. So again, all of these things combined need to be taken into consideration when thinking about objectives.
Is there anything of those, Brian? Is there one that's more important than the others, would you say?
I wouldn't say so. I think, you know, each and every one of them is important in its own right. And I do think they're kind of logical steps that follow after each other. So, you know, if you get it wrong in the first instance, you're probably not going to get to stage 5, for example, or whatever. But the reality is all of them, in my opinion, are equally as important. Mm-hmm. So we move on to kind of managing expectations, because I think often demand generation campaigns carry high hopes internally in organizations that they're magically going to solve some underlying issues around pipeline or you know, being behind the numbers in quarter, for example. But, you know, we need to balance up as professionals in this space, you know, what's realistic versus what's the need. Because if sales are coming to us and saying we need to close X million of pounds of pipeline in the next 3 months, but the reality is the sales cycles are 12 to 18 months in length, then clearly something's got to give. That's not going to happen. So for me, the real demand generation challenge is the balancing act between what we know people need and the pressure within the business versus actually what does history tell us, what's realistic, what's behavior that we've seen work and you know, has come through in the past. And it could well be that, you know, if you do need, you know, this pressure at the end of the quarter and you do need business to be closed, potentially a demand generation campaign isn't necessarily the right option for you. Potentially focusing on the pipeline that you already have within the business is a much better option. You know, how can we accelerate what we already know about? How can we take some of those leads that are sitting there at 10% and move those through the funnel quicker? And that potentially could take different tactics than simply going out to the market and trying to generate some more of those new leads that might turn into that huge project that everyone's hoping for. And at TMP, we call this, well, we see this or call it the effectiveness gap. And you know, we see it a lot across the industry as a whole. You know, there's ambition that's put on marketing that is really justifiable, but the reality doesn't always match up to the ambition. So, you know, marketing should be accountable for revenue. Absolutely. You know, that's a good ambition to have. But the reality is that, you know, conversion rates from marketing MQLs to close one business can be relatively low. So potentially, you know, just driving for more and more volume of MQLs shouldn't necessarily be the best success metric to be going after. Secondly, you know, marketing should be data driven. Yes, absolutely, of course it should. But we can see from our experience that actually being in a position to run true data driven marketing is incredibly difficult due to, you know, multiple CRM platforms or data sitting in multiple systems, and trying to bring all of that together to give that single view can often be incredibly challenging. And then, you know, marketing might want to pilot a new approach or target a new audience or go after a slightly different sales model. All these kinds of things are all absolutely valuable and hugely worthwhile. But it could well be that actually, you know, are the sales teams aligned? Are the individuals that we're looking to follow up on those opportunities, you know, confident in the refined pitch that based on the marketing activity that's been generated, or do they potentially lack some experience, or is it pushing them outside of their comfort zone? Because all of these things are then going to impact on the overall effectiveness of the activity, and, you know, it should be factored in at the front end when we're thinking about the objectives that we're setting. And, you know, these are just three particular examples. I'm sure all of you on this call today, within the context of your own organizations, will have effectiveness gap examples, you know, based on your specific organizations. So now we're going to just go into how do we set some realistic objectives and try and give you some framework tools that will help us to communicate that.
Yeah. Okay, so we've had a look at thinking about what's driving the ask up front. So why are we being asked to, or why are we thinking about running a demand generation campaign? Then we've looked at some hygiene factors. So once we're getting started, what are those very basic things that we need to be working through to think about how are these going to impact on our objectives to make them realistic? And then we've looked at the tension between what we're actually being asked to achieve versus what's realistic, and how we start to try and manage some of that tension and that gap. So here's a straightforward framework that you could use to calculate a target. So, for example, you can start from the bottom with this one, work up, or you can start from and go top down. So, say at the bottom you've been given a revenue target of £1 million. First of all, you're going to need to work out, or hopefully you might already know, what your average deal size is, so that you can work out how many deals you'll need to get that £1 million. So let's say average deal size is 100K, you're going to need 10 deals. So then how many leads are you going to need to generate? So again, you'll need to estimate, find out, project what a typical conversion rate might be from leads to deals. So let's say you need, it's a conversion rate of 1 in 5, you're going to need 50 leads to generate those deals. Then working back from that, you need to find out how many organizations you're going to need to speak to in order to generate a lead. So let's say you need to speak to 10 organizations, 10 accounts before you can generate a lead with them. That's a database of 500 organizations that you're going to need to include in your campaign as a minimum. And as I say, it might be you're looking at the other way around. So say you know what your size of market is, you know what the database is that you've got to go out after. You can then work back with those same conversions to work out roughly what you think your pipeline target, your revenue target might be for that size of market. So it's a nice basic framework. It's how you can work out an objective. That's basically it then. End of webinar, Brian, is that right?
Well, potentially, but you know, we've still got 15 minutes, so I can carry on. What I wanted to get across here is the point that, you know, generating demand is hard. I'm sure everybody on this call would agree with that, and have had your own experiences with it. But there are some things, there are some basics that if you get the basics right, it absolutely is going to make a big difference. You know, and this is about kind of not relying on the silver bullet, because unfortunately all of those are currently out of stock. So what are those things that if we're gonna focus and make sure that we do a few things really well, then these are what those things should be. So starting the start point for all successful demand generation, in my opinion, is with the data and the analytics. You know, the idea of, am I knocking on the right door? Absolutely critical, because that gives you the focus, that gives you the reason to have the confidence to start the outreach. Moving into strategy, you know, do they understand why I'm knocking on that door and then I'm not a criminal? You know, absolutely critical as well. Having that credibility around why we're having the conversation and why we've chosen you, this particular organization, to have that conversation with is absolutely going to be a major factor on whether or not the campaign objectives are met towards the end of the project. The third area is activation. You know, have they seen or heard me knocking? Absolutely. You know, grabbing attention requires being persistent, but it also requires a lot of skill, whether that's from, you know, creative and comms through to, you know, the outreach that's being done. And then we move into the opportunity generation. You know, did I actually convince them not to slam the door in my face? You know, this is all about the quality of the connection up front. You know, making sure that every touch point is maximized, every touch point is acted upon, and every touch point is treated with the level of professionalism that's required, not only to get across you know, the value of your brand and you know, the context of the conversation that you're trying to have, but ultimately, you know, it's all about making sure that you're looking as credible as you can, and the audience believes that this is a conversation they want to take forward with you. And the fifth step on the ladder is around pipeline progression. And, you know, did I actually listen to them, and can I demonstrate I can solve their challenge? So it's all well and good positioning a message to them, but actually, what's the insights? What's the feedback? What are they saying when you're pitching this to them? And are you listening, or are you just blindly going on and saying, no, this is what I want to sell you, when that isn't actually what they're telling you? So there's a degree of professionalism there that absolutely is essential. And if you can do those 5 things, then absolutely, you know, that's going to make a huge difference. But what we say is that at every stage through this journey, there's an opportunity to learn and refine and test and learn and make sure that you've got a mindset around continual optimization. Because again, for every piece of insight that you get from your audience, that's a piece of insight that can make your marketing better going forward, and also can make your campaigns more successful the next time that you run them. And to demonstrate the kind of the point, this is a real life example from one of our clients. And it's, you know, 8 weeks, 26 touch points, 3 different individuals that we've spoken to, gain referrals to, in order to get just one opportunity. So, you know, the idea that demand generation campaigns are a journey, not a sprint, is a key thing to factor in when you're considering your campaign objectives as well. And also the fact that not all data should be considered equal. The actual campaign, the data stage at the front end of any demand generation campaigns is probably one of the most critical factors when it comes to setting the campaign objectives. And, you know, I use this model here, which is a fairly simple 3-stage model to give a sense of where campaign data is in a life cycle. Quite frequently, the kinds of campaigns that we get briefed on would be new logo campaigns. You know, we want to target these accounts with this message. We've got no existing relationship with them. We're building the data from scratch, so we've got no kind of history with those individuals that we're targeting. You know, I'd put that data, those accounts, into the cold bucket, because ultimately, you know, we've got no intelligence, we've got nothing to go on. We're kind of shooting a little bit in the dark, really, hoping that the strategy and the account selections, all the assumptions we made up to that point were correct. But it's not until we actually get through the program and we start to talk to our audience that we can then start to move some accounts into what we call a cleansed phase, which is, you know, we've started to uncover some account intelligence. We started to validate that the topic is of interest, but we maybe haven't managed to speak to or have some dialogue with the decision makers at this point. But you know, it's a warmer conversation than cold, because we can refer to account intelligence, etc., through some of the conversations that we're having. The third stage would then be what we classify as follow-up, where, you know, interest in the topic's been ascertained, or we've understood when a renewal date or an incumbent vendor has been identified, and then we can then start to be really quite specific with the demand generation outreach around, this is the reason why I want to talk to you, this is the reason why it's relevant right now. And, you know, that's really important, because if your campaign data is all in the cold stage, then obviously that's going to take some time to warm through, and that should be built into your campaign objectives right from the outset of these projects. If your campaign data is all in the follow-up stage, which, you know, would be a lovely thing if that was the case, then, you know, you should be setting much bolder objectives around what the activity is going to deliver. So it's just making sure that when you're thinking about your campaign objectives, you know, putting it into this kind of context really does help to get you to think about the right things around the kinds of results that you're likely to achieve. But what we also know is that, you know, existing customers are customers who have the potential to cross-sell and upsell, but you've also probably got a decent amount of account intelligence on them already, and that would automatically then move them from, say, a cold account into probably the cleansed or the follow-up pot. So again, when we're thinking about at the beginning of the you know, the presentation around the context for the campaign, if sales are looking for closed won business over a shorter period of time, perhaps an existing customer targeted campaign could be more fruitful than trying to go after new logo campaigns, based on this three-stage model, because we can go in with more insight, we can be more confident around the reasons why we're engaging, and we're more likely to get the traction on the back of it.
And what we're looking at on this model here is to say also a really important thing is to make sure that the campaigns, wherever possible, are not running in silos. So if you're looking at your campaigning as one integrated piece where, you know, as relevant, you're bringing in the data and the positioning that you need along that continuum of campaigning, you're going to be a lot more effective. And similarly, if you're thinking in a consistent way all the way down the funnel, so from your brand awareness work down to sales activation, we advocate for that, because we can see, demonstrated from a couple of charts here on the right, which is from a particular client we worked with, over a 3-year period, if you are taking that test and learn approach and refining, you know, working on optimizing that data, building in the learnings over that period, then you'll see an increase in your conversion rates, which is what we're seeing in the top graph there. And also you can show that for every pound spent, you're getting more back over the period of time, because you're continually improving what you're doing. So what we're saying is you can use a framework like this to create a target. You need something to start from, but hopefully what the message that's come across loud and clear through the webinar is there are a lot of different variables, there are different levers and things that you can tweak and things you need to think about. So, you know, if you're thinking about the organization level, for example, is that database that you've got full of cold data, or is it in the middle or the you know, the follow-up phase? The lead conversion, is your brand well known? Are you likely to struggle to have conversations with those accounts and generate leads? So at every stage, you can think back to what we talked about and try and work out what level of impact those different answers to those questions are going to have as you work out your target, whether it's going down to the lead the pipeline target, or thinking about the organizations at the top.
Okay, so final slide. Every good webinar finishes with a good checklist, and we're no different. So we've pulled together a few final thoughts around what some things to take away around setting some good objectives for your demand generation campaign. So these are 5 questions that I would strongly recommend you think about the next time that you're planning and delivering one of these programs. So history is absolutely critical. You know, are you asking for performance that has been achievable to date? Because if it hasn't been achievable to date, but you're expecting it from this particular program, you have to ask yourself, you know, is that realistic? Because there's no reason why some program will overachieve on what's typically been the norm up to this point. So looking back at history is a critical thing. Data quality is absolutely essential. Are you confident in the quality of your targeting? Not only from an organization perspective, have you done the analytics? Have you thought about, why you're choosing those accounts? What markers specifically are you choosing those accounts on? But also, how confident are you of the individuals within those organizations, and making sure that you've got the right people that are going to understand your message and be engaged by it. The strategy and the messaging is key. How differentiated is your messaging? Because if it's a generic approach to an audience that's well targeted by lots of vendors, the generic approach is unlikely to cut through. So really putting yourself in the shoes of the audience and making sure that there's something within the messaging that, if you were in that individual's position, you would sit up and take notice to. Second to last is adopting that continual improvement mindset. Have you built in a mechanism to test and learn the messaging and the targeting? Making sure that you're obsessed about looking at the levers, understanding what's working, what isn't working, and then having an agile approach to the way that you're thinking about your marketing activity is critical. We see very limited success with a kind of a one-size-fits-all approach. And the final piece is really, we all know that patience is a virtue. Have you allowed enough time to see the success filter through? Because if you haven't, then your objectives are going to fail right from the outset. You have to understand how long these things take, and ultimately you have to be in a position to be patient and make sure that you've given it enough time. So thank you. I appreciate everybody who's taken the trouble to listen to us today and take on the advice that we're given. And at this stage, Heather, over to you.
Yeah, so we have got a question from Teresa, who is saying, when trying to get an answer from sales on what their goal is, number of leads, revenue desired, I'm met with, how many can you get us? Especially with organizations that have not done online demand generation. How do you deal with this?
It's a good question, and I'm sure that's the kind of thing that a lot of people get hit with. I think it goes back to the points that we made earlier, which is, why are they asking for how many can you get us? Who's going to be following up on this? If you were to get them a lot of leads, have they got the bandwidth to physically deal with it? And if they haven't got the bandwidth to deal with it, then actually what you should be doing is going for a smaller quantity of leads, but making sure that they're potentially a better quality. So I think at that point, you really need to have a conversation with sales to say, well, what does a good lead look like? And if they turn around and say, it's a CIO who's got the checkbook open and is ready to sign, say there aren't many of those leads out there, certainly not cold from a demand generation campaign. So we probably need to rethink the objective. So I think based on some of the early slides that we went through in the webinar, hopefully that gives you enough ammunition to go back to sales with some more pertinent questions that will hopefully allow them to give you a better brief.
Great. And the other question we've actually answered here on the slide, which is for someone who missed the first 10 minutes, will there be a link sent out of the recording? Because we've done it through a LinkedIn event, we can't automatically email you. But if you are interested in getting the slides or the webinar, you can see on the screen there Emma's email address, and she will happily send those out to you afterwards. But otherwise, unless there's any more questions, we are coming towards the end. You can always contact Brian directly or me directly on LinkedIn if you want to follow up with any further questions, or, as I say, drop Emma a line and we can take any more discussion offline. But I think that's probably it from us. So thank you very much for joining us, and goodbye.
Great. Goodbye.